So good morning.
Good morning.
It's my pleasure to be here at New Thought, Philadelphia on this rainy October 9th. So, April 5th, 1865, Secretary of State William Seward took a devastating fall from his carriage. He broke his arm, he sprained his foot, and he broke his jaw in 3 places. Nasty, right? Imperfect. Bad, wouldn't you say? Especially in 1865.
I go with that, yeah.
Yeah. Well, he was at home recuperating, and 9 days later, an assassin broke into his house with a knife, intending to kill him. However, doctors, in an effort to repair his jaw, had encased his neck with a wire mesh that deflected the assassin's blade that was aimed for his jugular vein. So, what the Seward family had seen as imperfect, even bad, turned out to be pretty perfect, I would say. Right? So, if you're thinking right now that I'm standing up here to talk about seeing the silver lining, I guarantee you that it is much deeper than that. Okay, so here we go. So, what was the spiritual truth underneath this event of falling off the carriage? That there is only perfection. The universe, believe it or not, knows what it's doing. So Ernest Holmes wrote, "There's an inner life of complete perfection that exists at the center of everything. Otherwise, nothing could be. We should identify ourselves with this perfect pattern of our being, claiming its reality in our experience, and continuously knowing that we are animated by the living spirit." So the experiences in our lives happen in complete order, complete perfection, because that is the nature of the universe. The universe is an orderly place, even though it might not seem like it, especially in the wake of this hurricane. Do you know how orderly the universe is? My daughter was living in Orlando up until a week ago last Monday. But she was home. She was home during the hurricane, and I didn't have to worry about her. Perfect, right?
Amen.
Unfortunately, we mess with that perfection. We just can't help ourselves sometimes. We mess around with it. Why? Ernest Holmes says that even though we're born of spiritual perfection, because we have creative minds ourselves and are individuals, we can think independently of the fundamental harmony of the universe. He said that in How to Use the Science of Mind. We have a choice. We have free choice. We can choose perfection or we can choose imperfection. So I have some examples of how we mess with the perfect order and the perfection of the universe. So in 1930s Australia, the farmers there had a problem with the Frenchie's gray beetle and the cane beetle. It was eating their sugarcane crops. So they were at a conference in the Caribbean when they learned about the cane toad. And they came back to Australia, and for 2 years they lobbied the government of Australia to allow them to bring the cane toads to Australia to take care of the beetle problem. So finally, in 1935, the government gave in and allowed the farmers to bring in 102 cane toads from the island of Hawaii. So these cane toads, they measure about 10 inches from snout to vent. They're huge. Has anybody ever seen one? Oh, I was on a hike when we lived in Hawaii, and one appeared in my path. Startled the heck out of me. They live 10 to 12 years. They've got longevity. They weigh about 3.5 pounds. These are some serious toads, right? So they kept them in captivity when they got them to Australia for a few months, and they bred them until there were 3,000 of these cane toads. And then they released them in Queensland in the sugarcane fields to take care of the beetle problem. Problem solved, right? Well, that plan did not work so well because the beetles went to the top of the sugarcane and the toads can only jump about 2 feet. So they weren't actually able to eat the beetles. But these toads are voracious eaters. They like to eat. Today they eat insects, birds, eggs, table scraps, native frogs, small pets, pet food, and even each other. Domesticated cane toads have even been reported to have eaten a ping pong ball as it bounced by. So they love to eat. So in Australia, around a water source like a pond, they can clear about 100-yard radius. Just clear it of any food, any vegetation. And they're poisonous. They have glands on their shoulders that have poison in them. And now these cane toads have spread, and they occupy 310,000 square miles from Queensland to the northeast corner of New South Wales to the tropical rainforest of the Northern Territory of Australia. They're wreaking havoc there. Okay. The government of Australia even started the National Cane Toad Task Force in 2004. They budgeted $5 to $7 million over 15 years to combat the cane toad problem. They even put a beer bounty on them. Take a toad, you can go turn it in for a glass of beer. And other various creative solutions. And you know what the kicker is? Sugarcane is not even native to Australia. It was brought in 1788. It shouldn't have even been there in the first place. It was not a native plant. The beetles, on the other hand, were native to the continent. So that's an example of how we add something. We think there's imperfection, so we add something to try to make it perfect. Okay? So we don't always add. Sometimes we subtract, take something away to try to get this perfection that we're after. So I have an example of that. It actually came from the spiritual cinema movie Druid Peak. Do you know about spiritual cinema?
We don't have
Subscription?
one. We know about it.
Yeah, so pretty cool. I get these and watch them. So the beginning of the 20th century, the National Park Service sought to eradicate predators from national parks, including the gray wolf from Yellowstone. So they started out to do this, and by 1926 they had killed all of the gray wolves in Yellowstone. So what ended up happening with that subtraction of what they saw as bad and imperfect in the gray wolf was just complete havoc in the park's ecosystem. So the moose and the elk grazed in the same place all season. There was no reason to move around. So trees stopped growing in those places. The birds didn't have a place to build their nests. The beavers didn't have the willow trees that they needed to build their dams, so their population decreased. And without the dams, there were no places for insects and frogs and fish. Right? So complete havoc here by subtracting something from that perfect order of the universe. Right? So wolves were reintroduced in 1995. So then the moose and the elk started moving around. They had to deal with predators now. They started moving. The trees started coming back. The beavers started coming back because they had things to build with, etc., etc. But that's an example of how we subtract something to try to get this perfection. So how do we know that it's true that the universe operates in complete perfection? I just threw it out there as a given, but how do we know that? There's a passage I'd like to read you from Heart of the Soul by Gary Zukav and Linda Francis. They write, when you can see clearly the relationship between the choices you have made and the circumstances around you, you will see the perfection of your circumstances. Then you will be able to change them. Until then, you will regret your circumstances, be surprised by them, reject them, or cling to them. You will see yourself at the mercy of a random dynamic or a capricious universe. The dynamic that creates your circumstances is not random. You are that dynamic. You create continually and perfectly. Whether you make your choices consciously or unconsciously, you create circumstances and experience them. What do we call this in science of mind? Cause and effect, right? This dynamic is perfect. The law of cause and effect always works. The circumstances that you create are perfect because they always reflect your choices. Every circumstance offers you an opportunity to see the relationship between it and the choices that created it, the choices you have made. The spiritual principle works perfectly every single time. Right? Spiritual laws are like the law of gravity. The law of gravity doesn't work sometimes and not other times, right? It always works. So Ernest Holmes says, the principle is perfect, complete and limitless, but your thought circumscribes its action and causes the very mind of freedom to create conditions which you call bondage. Right? It's that free choice that we have. So I have an example that I just love of someone who took something that looked imperfect and just chose to realize the utter perfection in it. So there was a 27-year-old Navy SEAL named Brad Snyder. He was serving in Afghanistan in 2011. He was working with Afghan special forces looking for Taliban, and they were clearing a minefield. Two of the Afghanis got off track. They exploded an IED. Snyder went to help, and an IED exploded in his face. He had 100 hours of surgery, but they could not save his eyesight. And he told journalists that he was prepared to lose an arm or a leg or even his life. But the blindness, he didn't see that coming. This had been an imperfect outcome. But Snyder was the captain of the Naval Academy swim team when he was a midshipman. And he was doing some water therapy, and he really enjoyed that. And one thing led to another. And 5 months after his accident in Afghanistan, he found himself competing in a qualifying meet for the 2012 Paralympics in London. So He ended up going to the Paralympics in London. He won gold medals in the 100-meter freestyle and the 400-meter freestyle. That was great. He came back to his life, and he started doing the things that he thought he should be doing. Getting a job in corporate America like most of his classmates were doing. So he went on job interviews. They didn't go very well. But finally something shifted in him so that he could see the perfect opportunity that was in front of him. He said, I had this opportunity sitting here and I largely ignored it because I was trying to make something else happen. I had this other image in my mind of what I needed to be, based largely on what my peers were doing. So he was using somebody else's version of perfection over here to decide what he should be doing in his life. He decided then that he would train for the 2016 Paralympics in Rio. I have a picture of him too. Pretty nice, I think. I like him. There he is. Brad Snyder. And you wonder how he knows when to turn? That was really interesting to me because I'm a swimmer too. His coach taps him on the back when it's time to do his flip turn. Pretty cool. And he wears protective sleeves so that he doesn't hit when he hits the lane lines. It's pretty painful to hit the lane line. He protects his arms. So, you want to hear his medal count for Rio?
Sure.
Anybody know?
Yeah.
Okay. Gold medals in the 50, 100, and 400 meter freestyle, and a silver. This makes me cry. A silver in the 100 backstroke. Not too shabby, huh? Yeah. So now he has this whole other life. He's a professional speaker, and he just released a book that I need to get my hands on called Fire in My Eyes. It's his story. So he took this thing that looked so imperfect, and he chose to saw the perfection in it, right? And he didn't resist it. Because that's what happens too. We resist things. Making me hurry here. All right.
Take some extra minutes.
Okay. Well, Ernest Holmes says that we build these images of imperfection, and then we worship those rather than seeing our own perfection, right? It's a mistake we make, learning experience we have. So I'm not asking you to look at things that look bad and just say, oh, it's perfect, it's fine. I'm not asking you to do spiritual bypass. But I am going to ask you to challenge those things that look imperfect. So here's another quote here from Gary Zukoff and Linda Francis. They said, it is one thing to observe a circumstance, and it is another thing to resist it. Challenging and changing a circumstance and resisting it are different. Challenging a situation is using your will, or I would say your conscious mind, to change what you are experiencing, to change the dynamic within yourself that is producing the situation. Resisting is wishing in that moment that you were not experiencing it. It is attempting to stop the experience. This is important to understand because you will not be able to effectively change a circumstance in your life while you are resisting it. Resisting anything requires energy, and that laws of energy is stress. So Brad Snyder challenged this situation. He didn't resist it, he challenged it. So Ernest Holmes says the idea of perfection is the spiritual power which heals. So how do we get to the place where we see the perfection? How do we get to the place where something bad appears to happen, but we go to the place of my life is unfolding for the highest and best despite any appearance to the contrary? How do we get there? It's one thing for me to talk about it, but how do we get there? Well, you've got, Ernest Holmes says, through right thinking, right? So how do you get yourself to the place of right thinking? Well, there's prayer. This is how Ernest Holmes defined prayer. He said, more than an act of the intellect, it is an act of one's whole being, a complete giving of oneself to the realization of perfection. A complete giving of oneself to the realization of perfection, being an ever-present fact in everyday experience. Right? So there's prayer. There's meditation. There's spiritual reading. But the most important way, and you knew I would not say this when I was up here, right? The most important way is for you to be in class. Class is where you take this teaching from theory to practice. And Ernest Holmes says right in the Science of Mind textbook that there's a tendency in this teaching for too much theory and too little practice. In class, you are an active participant. In class, you are held accountable, because there's class every week, right? For being there and for doing the work of change. How many of you are students in classes here? Oh, good. Okay. All right. How many of you are signing up for that next 4 agreements class? Okay. All right. Just got to say that. And I wanted to just share, I got permission to do this. This is from an email from one of my students that I got the other day. She says, Joanne, I enjoyed the class last night. I recognize that I feel very connected to the people that attend. I am absorbing a lot from the book and the class. Something is changing within me. I mentioned that in class last night, but it is a much bigger picture than what I had mentioned. I am sure it will all come into form at some point in time. I am watching. It has been a really hard past 2 years, and I am ready to be at peace. So this is a student who's been studying with me for about 8 years. So this is often not a quick process. It's not a speedy thing. And most of the time there's not an easy button. So this is my bottom line affirmation that I came to when I was in practitioner class. And it's, my life is unfolding for the highest and best despite any appearance to the contrary. So I'm going to invite you to say that with me. My life is unfolding for the highest and best despite any appearance to the contrary. So thank you for having me here. See the perfection in your lives before you choose to see the imperfection, because we do live in an orderly and perfect universe. And so it is.
So it is.